There's Richard Anderson, facilitated video instruction in low resource schools.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be able to open the talk session at ICTD. So today what I'm going to talk about is work that we've been doing in India for the last 5 or 6 years around facilitated video instruction. And the basic question is that we've been looking at how tutored video instruction works in rural primary schools and wanting to understand the impact of this intervention. So the basic idea is lessons have been recorded in better schools and good schools. They're being used in rural schools by the teachers in an interactive form, alternating between video instruction and personal interactive instruction. And so we've been wanting to see how this works. The goal of the intervention is first to augment the teaching capacity of the teachers in the remote schools who often lack background in the content areas they're teaching. And it also has the aim of changing the pedagogy that's used in the schools from direct presentation to a more interactive form of instruction. So the Digital StudyHall methodology starts with lessons recorded in central schools. The lessons are first designed with the rural students in mind, that they're tied to the regular curriculum, and the intervention is also based on first training the facilitators to use this. The facilitation model is a mix of video instruction plus interaction between the teacher and the students. There's a real focus on what we call cost realism. So in the classroom, it's a television set and a DVD player aiming at a cost of about $300 per classroom to run the system. The target is rural India, that we're working in the government schools, which are the lowest tier of instruction. The projects that I'm talking about was in North India in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And we worked in 11 schools. These schools were receiving Digital StudyHall for the first time. So we wanted to look to see how Digital StudyHall performed in new schools. So the question, does it work? What do I mean, does it work? That as an educational intervention, the gold standard for success is to show an intervention improves education measured in terms of improved performance based on pre-tests and post-tests. Since we're interested in pedagogical change, another impact measure we were looking for was, does this change how instruction takes place? Another thing to look at is just how it improves process. That does attendance improve? Does hours of instruction increase? A final measure is kind of consumer adoption. That is this intervention something that is going to last? So my definition of sustainability here is, would Digital StudyHall continue to be used with limited intervention, limited visits for assessment? The last measure, that I guess if the system isn't sustainable, the first three don't really matter at all. So the main result from our study is that after running the study for 2 years, to admit that we do not believe that this intervention is sustainable in large scale in Uttar Pradesh, that there are substantial challenges to keeping it going in the schools. To be honest, we feel that if we left it running in the schools, it would very, very quickly fall into disuse in the majority of the schools without monitoring visits. That also our attempts at measuring outcomes were completely inconclusive. So there are a set of caveats, and maybe since I'm presenting a negative result, I want to frame the negative result with a narrow scope. So you could easily ask, what about other types of schools? How would this do in private schools versus government schools? I honestly don't know. There are a lot of differences. Other geographies, how would South India compare to North India? Again, I'm not generalizing this result to other school systems or other geographies. There were also a set of positive results associated with this, that by and large teachers and students were very positive on the project, that the methodology was successfully adopted. So the form of video instruction, that teachers used it in the expected way, they were interactive using the lessons. A couple of the schools would have continued using the intervention after we left. And the biggest caveat to the work is that there are some counterexamples, that other schools that have used Digital StudyHall that are clearly thriving with the intervention. So our study design was to work in a block of schools. The block that we were working in had 20 schools. We selected the 11 schools that were the most promising for Digital StudyHall. That these schools had not previously used Digital StudyHall, so we wanted to look to see how it worked in new schools, that we went through an introduction process of getting principal buy-in, workshops with the teachers. First year we had a pre-test, post-test methodology with control and treatment classes. Second year we focused entirely on observation and interviews for evaluation. The testing was unsuccessful, the results were inconclusive, and after investing a lot of effort in pre-tests and post-tests, I came away with the conclusion that even if Digital StudyHall was working very, very well, we wouldn't have been able to measure any difference in the classes. And in fact, I talked about the testing in the fail-fair session last night, that there were lots of reasons why the pre-test and post-tests did not work out successfully. One of the reasons being just a small number of students that we had that took both the pre-test and the post-test. That looking at the Venn diagram of pre and post, the intersection was disappointingly small because of attendance challenges. So for analyzing the work we've done, that in the literature on facilitated video instruction, that most of the work has focused on higher education. But there's still a lot of relevance of this in setting up a framework to look to see how the various actors interact around this form of video-based instruction. So the key for looking at facilitated video instruction is how the video teacher interacts with the facilitator and the students, the interaction on those three legs of the triangle. The other thing that's been critical in previous deployments in different settings of facilitated video instruction is how the implementing organization interacts with the students and the instructors. That in this case, the implementing organization was a private school in Lucknow, India, that quite a bit of work was done to ensure that there was adequate buy-in from principals, that teachers were generally accepting of the institution that was involved in the study. Students were very, very positive about interacting with an external organization around the project. One of the interesting things that was done in this project is videos were created in an urban school, but when videos were created, the students in the video were drawn from the urban poor. So there was thought to match the students in the video with the target students in the primary schools. This turned out to work very, very well. In particular, when asked, the rural students identified directly with the students in the video, making remarks such as, they're just like us, they're slightly better dressed, but they speak the same language, they're just like us. So this aspect was successful in being able to match between the populations. It was also somewhat of a surprise to us how much the students wanted to use the intervention. In particular, the students were asking the teachers to use the video-based instruction in the class. The facilitators, by and large, adopted the pedagogy around the intervention. So the pedagogy was to both use video but also to use classroom activities around the videos, so the teachers would lead songs, do poems, act out various concepts. And they picked this up that during regular monitoring visits, we did see that the intervention was picked up. There were also some unexpected things that came out. For example, without even suggesting it, we discovered a number of teachers were taking the DVDs home and watching the DVDs in advance of their lesson. For buy-in of the pedagogy, how much the teachers wanted to use it, here it was mixed. So some of the teachers saw value in the new techniques, adopted them, and internalized the ideas. Other teachers felt that they did not benefit from this support. So clearly mixed in teacher reaction to this. Teachers did use the system in other ways as well. For example, having the lessons used by students to review the material. Sometimes teachers would have students facilitate the lessons instead of facilitating directly. Another thing that came up is that in the school system, there's a distinction between the full teachers and para-teachers. Para-teachers being less educated people from the community who might teach classes 1 and 2, while the regular teachers teach class 3, 4, and 5. That there was a difference between the two, and in some cases, it was the para-teachers who were far more interested in adopting the methodology. So I've said that our conclusion, however, is that it's not sustainable. And direct evidence of it not being sustainable, that there was a clear correlation between how frequent our monitoring visits were and the use of the system. So when monitoring dropped off, it was used less and less in some of the schools. That a number of the schools had long power outages, things such as electrical wires being stolen going into the school. The negative evidence on that is the length of time it took to get the electricity repaired, and the fact that the schools were not making any push to have electricity reinstalled so that the intervention could be used. That we had several cases where equipment was stolen, and after that, those 2 of the schools that lost equipment did not want equipment back to risk theft again. That in general, a problem in the sustainability of this was a lot of teachers had very, very low effort in teaching in general. So some of it was not that the teachers were disinterested in using Digital StudyHall, but a broader issue around teachers not being present to teach. So the interesting thing is that, seeing the struggles in this new intervention, that we then looked at a school that had been using Digital StudyHall for 6 years and really had successfully introduced DSH into the school. That in this case, it was running on its own with limited monitoring. The school had purchased a second set of gear so that it had 2 instances running, that there was full buy-in from the school, used very widely across all subjects. That what was interesting is that for this school, the stories of the first couple years of this school matched what we saw in our schools of teachers not being very enthusiastic about using it, use dropping off, mixed buy-in to it. So it was just very, very interesting to see over the years an example that after 6 years, a real success and a real adoption as kind of a counterpoint. And internally this has raised a lot of questions for me. Is 2 years just too short to institutionalize this type of thing? That if broadly this type of intervention isn't going to succeed 100%, that in isolated cases, we saw a couple positives in our experience. This case, a minority of the institutions are going to adopt it and have a sustained impact. So just to summarize that, in this case, that we did take a project to the next level from individual offerings of Digital StudyHall up to doing 11 school intervention over a couple years, a fairly detailed study based on observation to see initial introduction and adoption. That this was clearly a very challenging environment. A lot of people have counseled me that we should have taken an easier target than North Indian government schools for this intervention. That we were clearly naive in our outcome, our attempts to assess outcomes based on pre and post tests. That there were also some interesting conflicts between this as a research project and this as an educational intervention. So just as a specific example, that I discovered that study staff, when they visited the schools, would sometimes end up giving lessons if teachers weren't present. So that they would step up, use the video gear for a lesson, or even just give a lesson without using the video gear. And when I first heard about this, I got really upset because it was clearly compromising the study of having the study staff intervening directly. That later in the second year, when it was clear that we were not getting rigorous measures of outcomes, I did ease up a bit because there were also valuable learnings that the study staff got from being teachers in the school. And finally, just one of the points to conclude on, which is fairly broadly recognized in this field, but really does need to be repeated continually, that in a system such as education, a technological intervention is only going to be a small component of a very complicated system that it's working inside. So I certainly want to acknowledge a large set of people that have worked on the development and deployment of Digital StudyHall, and I'd be happy to take a few questions right now.
We have microphones, I understand, and there's someone in the back there, and then there's just the one microphone. There's one there.
So, Lakshmi here. There are a lot of interesting hidden messages in your entire talk, and it's hard for me to piece out one from the other. One is that there is resistance to change, and resistance to change probably would have implications on adoption of anything new. Mm-hmm. The second thing is they could have scenarios where the way we are measuring something as an educational outcome would just be biased in a lot of different ways, though I do not know how JPAL is able to do 60,000 schools as a randomized control trial, and I do not know what what measure you can play on what numbers they've gotten and so on. Number three, so the first two issues have nothing to do with Digital StudyHall or on any technology. Number three is really, where does Digital StudyHall actually work and actually does not work. So an important subcomponent is among schools that are genuinely going to try out Digital StudyHall, only at that particular point can we have a conversation where, is this really measuring the right set of things or not? So am I correct in positioning this way? That's my overall, that's what I don't think you can just say that, Digital StudyHall does not work or things are not sustainable or scalable, but there are certain barriers before even we get to the point where we can even start measuring A versus B.
So I generally agree with you, although at this point, I certainly would not attempt to scale Digital StudyHall widely in the UP government schools. That I'm quite confident that it's premature to do that. That I think, one of the lessons I'm taking away personally from this is that their intervention was not mature enough to do the type of evaluation study that we were doing.
Could you just give a little bit of background as to the origins of, how did Digital StudyHall start, who envisaged it, and how did you get involved?
So Digital StudyHall was founded by Randy Wang, that he was a Princeton professor of computer science who left Princeton with the idea of setting up Digital StudyHall, moved to Lucknow and built it up personally, that just through academic connections, I got brought into starting to work with Digital StudyHall since I had a previous background in other tutored video instruction projects.
Other questions?
Richard, so if you had to rerun this entire study, what is the first thing that you would do differently?
So clearly it was premature to do the outcome assessments. That I think for a study that to have a more careful implementation would be essential. That I think we were doing absolutely the right thing in taking Digital StudyHall from something that had been done primarily in one-off schools and trying to go to the next level, which was a block, a dozen schools, and sticking with it for 2 years to see what happens. So I guess I'd say, the changes would be more just at the operational level as opposed to truly strategic.
One more question. So do you have any thoughts on how you might incentivize teachers to participate, have more buy-in from teachers? So in the schools, incentivize that the teachers are a weak link in the government schools, and there's a far deeper problem in having teachers teaching in the schools than we could address with this technology. So, a set of the teachers were often reassigned to other duties, census duty or running vaccine campaigns. Teachers would regularly take a lot of time off or when present wouldn't teach. This is a deeper problem than would be addressed by this intervention. That one thing I think could work much better is a stronger focus on the para-teachers than on the full teachers.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Considering the power outage situation you mentioned, and coming from my world in Africa, where we have the situation of power, does digital learning fit in that environment? Or how can we move it into that environment?
So I'm afraid I didn't hear a portion of your question.
I'm saying you mentioned the issue of power outages.
Oh, okay.
That is hampering digital learning. I mean, looking at the African situation and the constant power issue, how can we move digital studies into that environment?
That we've certainly thought a lot about different sources of power, that in some of the deployments we have relied extensively on battery backup and other forms. That in this particular set of schools, the schools were newly electrified so that we did have grid power available. That one technology that is very attractive is to use portable video projectors, pico projectors, which have a 2 or 3 hour battery life, that if you can get the classrooms dark enough, then a portable video projector is a realistic technology to use.
Just one last question? Okay, well, thank you very much.